Retail customer response to COVID-19, Denton, Texas case study. I got a lot to share here, so let's get it going. So COVID-19, wide range of impacts on society, understatement of the year. It's kind of like saying it's cool in Winnipeg in the winter, but health, of course, community well-being, business, economic performance, all impacted. We need to understand how response is going on to the pandemic. And so our study here focuses on customer traffic level change relative to COVID-19. And so our study is from the very beginning of the pandemic to 6 months in. Study data from Maire, formerly Uber Media, tracking the location of mobile devices. So we're actually tracking devices, not people. So that might bother some people. There are some issues with these data that we'll have to deal with later. No time, got to keep on going. 6 major retail service districts in Denton, Texas. Here they are, and I guess the main point that I want to make is that they're diverse. There's retail strips, power centers, kind of food and drink oriented shopping centers, the whole gamut in a city of 130,000. So what did we do with the districts? We analyzed device appearances, so we're focused on the devices, not the people, although really we care more about the people. Designed to capture parking lot and business building areas, not adjoining roads and highways. So, oops. Just there's Golden Triangle Mall as one example, capturing just the facility itself. And Razor Ranch is a good example where Highway 380 kind of cuts through it. And you can see we're avoiding the traffic that goes through. Also, we're focusing attention on first and only visits because of concern over standardization. We were concerned about interpretation of different kinds of visits, and so we might revisit, although some of that's a data limitation, so I don't know how much we can overcome there. But first and only visits, we're talking about capturing the date of visit and, of course, the place of visit of every one visit device. So they only visited once during our study period. So here's the phases that we were looking at. If you break down our 6 months period, phase 1, initial lockdown, phase 2, early reopening, phase 3, late reopening, phase 4, summer wave, and phase 5, fully open. So each one of these is keyed to an executive order by the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. And so that's how that plays out in terms of time. And you can see some of these are about closing and more restriction, and some of them are about opening and freeing things up, and they really freed things up here. And so here's tracking those COVID-19 cases by date reported for Denton and area. You can see the different phases and the different prevalences of the disease burden over time. So that's kind of all setting up the study itself. I'd like to get to the study results and the time analysis. So here's a track of the customer visits to each of the 6 districts. So you can see University Drive is by far the most prevalent. Razor Ranch, Denton Square following. Fry Street at the very bottom, very small, but each one of these is important in its own way. And so, of course, we can put up the phases. We can track the phases by district. And overall, in every retail district, the biggest change in terms of loss and recovery happened actually in phases 1 and 2, which before I looked at the data, I wouldn't have said that because there's been so much news over time as far as changes over the whole period of the pandemic. But really, it was the first 2 months where most of the change happened. So that's interesting. There are also important differences, distinctions by district in phases 3 to 5. But you can see that it's still volatile, but there's stuff going on. So I'm going to represent what's going on there just by focusing on Razor Ranch. And somehow I zoomed in, and I don't know how I did that. Oh, there. Wow, I learned something new about PowerPoint. Razor Ranch. Diverse power center developed in 2010. There is just a focus on their daily visits and by phase. So what I'd like to say here, I think most characteristic of phases 1 and 2, big early decline, no shock there. Very strong early recovery. Actually, they recovered to higher than they were at the very beginning. So that's interesting. Phases 3, 4, and 5, you can see there's still some turbulence. It's still bouncing around, but so the turbulence doesn't end, but visits stayed high overall, I think we could argue. So Denton Square, just an overall look at the historic downtown of the city. That's its traffic profile. And again, breaking it into phases and looking at the decline and the recovery. A similar decline to Razor Ranch, but look at that recovery, just really bouncing back, very much stronger than Razor Ranch. Phases 3, 4, and 5, they're also different in some ways. There's more variability overall, and we've got some down components and some up components, and the up component there is really substantial too. So that's just a little look into our data. There's much more there than I can talk about. With the spatial analysis, I'd like to deal with this together. And I just came up with some insights actually last night. So dangerous, last minute, revising paper before talk. Let's see how much sense this makes in the morning. One-time visits only, Denton Square. So just to focus on Denton Square, mean distance traveled, median distance traveled, total one-time visits. We could also label, we're looking at 2 time periods here. I'm bringing in the 6 months, that there's our major focus, but for perspective, I just wanted to include the first 12 months as well. So looking at that, the 6 and 12 month stats are very similar. So yeah, there is a continued change over time, but actually there's a lot of stability there that I wouldn't have predicted. But look at the robust growth in visits. So obviously the number of visits was changing quite a bit, but the geography of the visits actually didn't have a whole lot of difference. And Razor Ranch, again, kind of look at the distance traveled difference. So there's obviously a different drawing card in Razor Ranch. 130 mean distance traveled miles for Razor Ranch versus 81 to Denton Square. So it's just huge statistics. So there's a big drawing card there out into the countryside around Denton. And then, of course, there's a big discrepancy. Denton Square tends to be more food and entertainment versus Razor Ranch is really a regional center. And you can see 197,000 visits over the first 12 months. Big recovery. Okay, a little bit more perspective. Pandemic first 6 months versus 12 months. Again, just for Denton Square, we're breaking it down by who are the long distance travelers, and then really at the bottom there, the short distance stuff. And so what I want to focus on here, actually, the key change here, look at how Denton Square went from serving 29% of the population, 29% of their audience came from within 5 miles in the first 6 months versus 16%. So you could see a very local market early in the pandemic, and later in the pandemic, people were willing to travel more. No surprise there. But you could see the other figures there as far as 100 miles, 50 to 100 miles, they're not changing a whole lot. So something interesting there. But look at this. There's a lot of stability over time within the district, first 6 months versus 12 months. But look at that difference. Again, 30% of Razor Ranch's audience, and this is stable right from the beginning of the pandemic into a year, 30% made up of these more than 100-mile folks coming in. So I think that's really substantial. So to wrap things up here, time analysis, it really was a much shorter adjustment period overall than I would have predicted in terms of the important things really did happen up front in the pandemic. Graphs of customer traffic numbers indicate points of comparison and divergence, so there's comparability in the shapes of all the district response curves, but divergence. Razor Ranch maintains its recovering traffic, whereas Denton Square just has a little bit more bouncing around. The spatial analysis, overall, Razor Ranch, you can see it clearly is a retail magnet with a whole lot of customers driving over 100 miles to visit. But you could see the impact early in the pandemic versus Denton Square, lower customer range overall, and Denton Square serving a much larger local market than it did later. So in terms of public policy, I'd like to say something here, but it's so early in the morning and I've kind of run out of brain power, at least for the moment. This is a project in progress, and we'll continue interpreting this data, but this is kind of the broad outlines of what we're thinking so far. So I thank you for listening, and I welcome comments if people have any questions, or we could follow up later.